There are also concerns that Sarah Ferguson could potentially go rogue and start airing more secrets of the royal family.
They just exposed what was really happening inside that mansion. And nobody was supposed to find out. Prince Andrew arrested. The house was raided. And Sarah Ferguson vanished. Not a word. Not a trace. But here is what her inner circle does not want you to know. The emails. The secret meetings, the money, the hidden connections that go deeper than anyone has dared to say out loud.
Never complain, never explain. Well, that's been thrown out of the window, hasn't it? Spare us all. Well, Sarah Ferguson now is looking to do a tell-all memoir. And it's not the first one she did. She did one in 1996, the same year that she officially divorced Prince Andrew.
Everything she built, her title, her companies, her charity, her home, gone in weeks. And investigators are still not done. What comes next will shock you. She was not the one they came for. That matters, because in almost every headline written about what happened on the morning of February 19th, 2026, the name that appeared first was his. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, formerly His Royal Highness Prince Andrew, Duke of York, arrested on his 66th birthday at the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, held for 12 hours, released under investigation, driven home in a chauffeur car with his head down and the whole world watching. But there was another person whose life was falling apart that same morning, a person who had shared the same address as Andrew for the better part of 2 decades, a person whose name appears in the same files, the same email chains, the same financial records that triggered the arrest in the first place. A person who, as of the day Andrew was driven away from that police station, had not been seen in public for nearly 5 months, and whose location remained, officially, unknown. Sarah Ferguson, former Duchess of York, ex-wife, long-term companion, and, as the documents now make clear, a far more deeply connected figure in this story than most people had previously understood. To understand where she is now, you need to understand what she has lost, and the speed at which she lost it. For more than 20 years, Ferguson lived at Royal Lodge. That is the 30-room mansion set deep inside Windsor Great Park, the private royal estate south of Windsor Castle, that Andrew had leased since 2003. The couple had divorced in 1996, but their separation never quite translated into the kind of clean break that divorce is supposed to produce. They remained close. They co-parented their daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. They attended events together. They took holidays together. And from 2008 onwards, they lived together, in a house that sat on land belonging to the Crown, in one of the most private and protected corners of England. Whatever the legal status of their relationship, the practical reality was that Ferguson's life was built around that property and the stability it represented. That stability is now gone. In October 2025, King Charles formally stripped Andrew of his remaining royal titles. The announcement confirmed that Andrew would no longer use his Duke of York title in any official capacity, and that he was to be known simply as Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. Within days of that announcement, Ferguson stopped using her own courtesy title. She had been referred to publicly as Sarah, Duchess of York, for years, a title she had retained despite the divorce. When Andrew's titles went, hers went with them. She updated the official director listings for her companies at Companies House, switching her name from Sarah, Duchess of York, to Sarah Margaret Ferguson. A small administrative change on the surface. In practice, it marked the end of 30 years of public identity. Then came the eviction. Buckingham Palace confirmed that formal notice had been served on Andrew to surrender his lease on Royal Lodge. He was required to leave. Ferguson, who had been living there with him, was required to leave as well. By early February 2026, they were both gone. Andrew moved to a private accommodation on the Sandringham estate. Ferguson's destination was less clear. Reports at the time suggested she was planning to forge an independent life, that she had never requested property or any financial provision from the palace, and that she intended to make her own arrangements. What those arrangements actually looked like in practice was something nobody appeared willing to confirm publicly. 2 weeks after the eviction, Andrew was arrested. And 3 days before the arrest, something else happened that has received far less coverage than it deserves. On February 13th, 2026, a company called S Phoenix Events Limited, with Ferguson listed as its sole director, filed an application with Companies House to be struck off the register. That is the formal process for closing down a company in the United Kingdom. 3 days later, on February the 16th, 5 more companies followed. Philanthrepreneur Limited, Fergie's Farm Limited, La Luna Investments Limited, Solar Moon Limited, Planet Partners Productions Limited. All 6 had Ferguson listed as their sole director. All 6 filed for dissolution within days of each other, in the window immediately before Andrew's arrest. The nature of these businesses was not always obvious from their names or their filings. S Phoenix Events was listed as being connected to public relations and communications. Fergie's Farm was described as a retail business. The others had no clear public profile. What they shared was a single director, a single moment of collapse, and a very specific timeline. They did not close gradually over months, as inactive businesses sometimes do. They closed together, in a rush, in the days leading up to one of the biggest events in British royal history. Before the companies went, something else had already closed. Ferguson's charitable foundation, Sarah's Trust, announced in late January 2026 that it would be shutting down for the foreseeable future. The announcement came after months of internal discussion, according to the charity's own statement, but the timing was directly connected to the release of new Epstein files by the United States Department of Justice on January 30th. Those files had, among many other things, placed Ferguson squarely and uncomfortably in the frame. The total picture by the time Andrew was arrested was of a woman whose professional infrastructure had been dismantled with remarkable speed. A charity closed, 6 companies dissolved, a royal title relinquished, a home of 20 years vacated, and a public profile reduced to near zero, with no confirmed address and no statement of any substance from her or anyone speaking on her behalf. This did not happen slowly. It happened in the space of roughly 4 months, from October 2025 to February 2026. The pace of it is part of what makes it significant. This was not a gradual fading from public life. This was a rapid, coordinated withdrawal from every structure that connected Ferguson's name to the outside world, carried out at exactly the same time as the investigation into Andrew was building toward his arrest. Royal experts and commentators who spoke to various outlets in the days following Andrew's arrest were not especially sympathetic. One British royals expert, speaking to Fox News Digital, described Ferguson's behaviour as consistent with a track record of pursuing money and relationships without adequate concern for the consequences. Others pointed out that whatever legal agreements Ferguson may have signed, whatever explanations her representatives had offered in the past about the nature of her relationship with Epstein, the documents now in the public domain told a different story. A more detailed story. One that her previous statements had not fully accounted for. She had been in the Epstein files before. Her name had come up in previous rounds of document releases. Her spokesperson had put out statements. The general line had been that she regretted the association, that she had cut off contact as soon as she understood the full nature of the allegations against him, and that she condemned his actions absolutely. Then came January 2026 and the latest release of documents, and the statements from previous years, no longer held up against what was now on the public record. The emails were specific. They were dating. They showed a relationship that extended well beyond a passing social acquaintance, and well beyond the point at which Ferguson's own representatives had claimed that contact had ended. They showed warmth. They showed financial dependence. They showed a level of personal connection that could not be explained away as a regrettable mistake made before the full picture was known. The spokesperson's line had been that Ferguson severed ties as soon as she became aware of the extent of the allegations. The new documents showed contact continuing years after Epstein's 2008 conviction. That is not a minor discrepancy. That is the entire foundation of her public defense, undermined by her own written words. And the woman who wrote those words is currently somewhere in the world, location unknown, with no permanent home, no active companies, no charity, no title, and a story that is far from finished. There is a particular kind of silence that surrounds people when a story is still developing and the full picture has not yet emerged. It is the silence of careful legal advice, of representatives drafting statements that say as little as possible while appearing to say something, of institutions and individuals choosing their words with the kind of precision that only comes when the stakes are genuinely high. That silence has surrounded Sarah Ferguson for months now, but the emails do not share it. The emails say quite a lot. To understand what is in those documents, and why they matter as much as they do, you need to understand the timeline of Jeffrey Epstein's criminal history and where Ferguson fits within it. Epstein was convicted in Florida in 2008 on charges of soliciting prostitution from a minor. He served 13 months of an 18-month sentence and was released in the summer of 2009. For anyone connected to him, that conviction was the moment at which any reasonable assessment of who he was and what he had done became impossible to avoid. The facts were on the public record. The nature of the charges was clear. Whatever anyone had believed about him before that point, by the summer of 2009, there was no longer any ambiguity about the kind of man they were continuing to associate with. 5 days after Epstein walked out of prison, Ferguson visited him in Miami. That detail, contained in documents released by the United States Department of Justice as part of the ongoing Epstein files process, is not a minor footnote. It is the first data point in a sequence that runs directly counter to the narrative that Ferguson and her representatives had been putting forward for years. The official line had always been that she regretted the association, that she had distanced herself once she understood the full extent of what Epstein had done, and that her contact with him was limited and ended at an appropriate point. A visit to a convicted sex offender 5 days after his release from prison is not consistent with any of that. What followed the visit was a correspondence that, when read in full, paints a picture of a relationship that was emotionally close, financially entangled, and ongoing well into the period during which Ferguson was simultaneously telling the public that she had stepped back from her connection to him. In August 2009, roughly 2 months after her Miami visit, Ferguson wrote to Epstein to thank him for being, in her words, the brother she had always wished for. That kind of language carries weight. It is not the language of a business acquaintance, or of someone maintaining a connection out of social obligation. It is the language of genuine personal affection, expressed in writing, directed at a man who had just served a prison sentence for crimes involving a child. By January 2010, the correspondence had taken on a tone that became one of the most widely reported details when the documents were made public. Ferguson wrote to Epstein telling him that he was a legend, that she did not have the words to describe her love and gratitude for his generosity and kindness, and that she was at his service. She ended that particular passage with the words, "Just marry me." Whatever the intended register of those words, whether they were meant as a joke, a flattery, an expression of affection, or something else entirely, they were written to a convicted sex offender more than a year after his release from prison, and they are now part of the permanent public record. A separate email from May 2010 moved from affection to something more starkly practical. Ferguson wrote to Epstein asking why he did not simply employ her as his house assistant, describing herself as the most capable, and adding that she desperately needed the money. That email has attracted particular attention, not only because of what it says about the nature of their relationship, but because of what it reveals about her financial situation at the time. Ferguson had been open, over the years, about the fact that money had been a persistent problem. After her divorce from Andrew, she had received a settlement that, by the standards of royal divorce proceedings, was relatively modest. She had spoken publicly about debt. She had taken commercial work, endorsement deals, television appearances, public speaking engagements, all of it aimed at maintaining a lifestyle that her formal financial position did not easily support. The Epstein correspondence, read in this context, is the correspondence of someone who saw in Epstein not only a friend, but a resource. A person with money, connections, and the willingness to use both on her behalf. And Epstein, for his part, appears to have been happy to maintain that arrangement. Documents released as part of the American files suggest that he settled debts on Ferguson's behalf and that she had access to financial support connected to his network. A business contact wrote in 2009 that Ferguson had traveled to Nepal, paying for a first-class flight with a loan from a bank connected to financier David Rowland, and that Epstein had separately settled other debts she had accumulated. None of this places Ferguson in legal jeopardy by itself. Being in financial difficulty is not a crime. Corresponding warmly with someone whose crimes you have chosen to overlook is not a crime. Even accepting money from people connected to a convicted sex offender is not, in and of itself, a criminal matter. What it does, however, is establish a context. A context in which Ferguson was not a casual acquaintance who happened to know Epstein through her ex-husband. She was someone who needed things from him, who asked him for things directly, and who maintained that relationship across a sustained period while he remained a convicted criminal. That context becomes considerably more significant when you consider where most of this correspondence was taking place. Royal Lodge was not simply a home, it was a working base. Andrew used it as the center of his professional and personal life throughout the years he lived there. Meetings were held there, financial discussions were conducted there. Documents released as part of the American files show that Epstein was involved in conversations about investment strategy and household financial arrangements that were connected to Andrew's operations at the lodge. He was not just a visitor. He was, in a meaningful sense, a participant in the way that household functioned. Ferguson was living in that same building. She was present during the years in which Andrew and Epstein were conducting those conversations. She was corresponding with Epstein directly about her own financial needs, at the same time as Epstein was being consulted on financial arrangements connected to the household they both shared. The overlap between her personal correspondence with Epstein and the wider pattern of activity taking place inside Royal Lodge is not a coincidence to be dismissed. It is a thread that investigators, working through the material recovered from the estate, will presumably be following. There is also the matter of what Ferguson knew about Andrew's activities during the period covered by the investigation. Andrew is accused of forwarding confidential government documents to Epstein while serving as Britain's trade envoy, a role he held between roughly 2001 and 2011. Ferguson was living with him for part of that period. She was in regular contact with Epstein herself during that period. Whether she had any knowledge of what Andrew was sending to Epstein, and whether any of her own correspondence touches on the subject, are questions that the investigation has not yet addressed publicly. What the emails have already done, even before any formal charges have been brought against Ferguson personally, is strip away the version of events that her representatives had been maintaining for years. The careful, consistent public line, the one about regret and severed ties and condemning his behavior, was built on the claim that her contact with Epstein was limited and ended once the full picture became clear. The documents contradict that directly. The contact did not end. It continued through 2009, 2010, and into 2011, as demonstrated by a message Ferguson sent in September of that year, after Epstein had apparently been out of touch for a period, in which she told him she was still there with love, friendship, and congratulations on the birth of his child. That email was sent in 2011, more than 3 years after his conviction, from a woman who was living, at the time, in the same house where investigators would later spend days conducting a structural search that went well beyond what a simple document retrieval operation would require. Her spokesperson offered a response to some of the emails when they became public. The line was that certain messages had been written in the context of advice Ferguson had been given to manage Epstein's behavior, specifically his threats to sue her for defamation after she had publicly associated him with pedophilia. The argument, essentially, was that the warmth in the emails was strategic rather than genuine, a way of managing a dangerous man rather than an expression of real feeling. That explanation may carry some weight for some people. It is not, however, an explanation that covers every email. It does not explain the visit to Miami 5 days after his release from prison. It does not explain asking to be employed as his house assistant. And it does not explain maintaining correspondence for years in ways that go beyond anything that could reasonably be described as damage limitation. The documents are what they are. They were written by her hand, sent from her accounts, and have now been read by investigators, journalists, and millions of ordinary people who had no particular reason to be following this story until it became impossible to ignore. Whatever Sarah Ferguson believed she was doing when she wrote those emails, and whatever she believed the consequences of that correspondence might eventually be, the words themselves are fixed. They do not change depending on the explanation that surrounds them. They say what they say. And what they say has made the silence that followed all the more deafening. At some point in the autumn of 2025, Sarah Ferguson made a decision. It was not a decision she announced publicly, and it was not one that her representatives have since explained in any detail. But the effects of it are visible in everything that followed. She went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from a busy schedule or a temporary retreat from the spotlight, but a deliberate, sustained, and carefully maintained absence from public life that has now stretched across several months and shows no signs of ending. The last time anyone photographed her in a setting that could be considered normal public life was September 25th, 2025. She was seen leaving Royal Lodge on that occasion, and the images taken of her that day have since become, by default, the most recent record of where she was and what she looked like before everything accelerated. Since then, there have been no public appearances, no confirmed sightings at events, no interviews, no social media activity of any substance, and no statement from her personally about any of the events that have unfolded around her. For a woman who had spent the better part of 3 decades maintaining a public profile through books, television appearances, commercial endorsements, charity work, and a willingness to speak openly about her own life even when that life was not going well, the silence is striking. It is the kind of silence that does not happen by accident. What is known about her movements in the months since that photograph comes from a handful of reported sightings and sources speaking to various outlets. None of it officially confirmed by Ferguson herself or anyone formally representing her. According to reports that emerged in late February and early March 2026, she spent time at a wellness clinic in Zurich, Switzerland. That detail fits a pattern. Ferguson had strong connections to Switzerland going back years. She and Andrew had jointly owned a chalet in Verbier, a high-end ski resort, which they had used as a family retreat and which she had at one point described as her home. The chalet was eventually sold, but her familiarity with Switzerland and the relative ease with which a person with the right connections can maintain a low profile there made it a logical destination. From Zurich, reports placed her at a second location. According to the Daily Mail, she was spotted at Ballyliffin Lodge and Spa in Donegal, on the northern coast of Ireland. It is a remote setting, chosen, according to a source familiar with her movements, precisely because it offered minimal chance of her presence becoming known to anyone outside her immediate circle. The same source described her as working out what to do next, a phrase that, given everything that had happened in the preceding months, carries considerably more weight than it might in ordinary circumstances. She had stayed at the same location before and knew it to be the kind of place where a person could pass time without being observed. The picture that emerges from these reported movements is not of someone on a planned holiday or a wellness break taken for its own sake. It is of someone moving carefully between locations that share a set of common features, private, familiar, remote, and offering minimal exposure to the kind of public scrutiny that has become, for Ferguson, an existential risk rather than simply an inconvenience. Some former hosts, according to at least one report, have become reluctant to be seen offering her help. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment. Ferguson has always relied on a network of wealthy and well-connected friends to supplement the unpredictability of her own financial situation. That network, over the years, has included people in business, entertainment, and international society who were willing to extend hospitality, open doors, and, in some cases, provide direct financial support. The suggestion that some within that network are now keeping their distance is not a small development. It points to a social and reputational withdrawal that goes beyond the press coverage and extends into the private world of personal relationships and mutual obligation on which Ferguson has long depended. One stop on her current itinerary, according to reports picked up by Page 6 and subsequently covered more widely, was the home of Priscilla Presley, a longtime acquaintance in the United States. The image of a former member of the British royal family moving between the homes of international acquaintances without a fixed address of her own is one that several commentators have seized on as emblematic of how dramatically her circumstances have changed. One report described her situation plainly as effectively homeless. That framing may be somewhat dramatic given the resources and connections still available to her, but the underlying point is real. The woman who lived in a 30-room royal mansion for the better part of 2 decades does not currently have a permanent home. The daughters have said nothing either. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, Ferguson's 2 daughters with Andrew, have both maintained a silence that, in some respects, mirrors their mother's. Neither has made a public statement about their father's arrest. Neither has appeared in a context that could be read as a deliberate public signal of any kind. Their whereabouts in the immediate aftermath of the arrest were described as unknown, in the same terms used to describe Ferguson's own location. For 2 women who both have public profiles and active lives, the collective absence from anything that could be considered public engagement in the period following the arrest has been notable. Their position is not a comfortable one. They are, by any reasonable assessment, caught between 2 impossible sets of demands. On one side is the relationship with their father, whose legal situation is serious and ongoing, and whose isolation from the formal structures of royal life has been near complete. On the other side is the relationship with the wider royal family, with their cousins and their uncle, the king. An institution that has made very clear through its actions over the past year that its priority is distance and separation from the Andrew situation rather than solidarity with it. And running through all of that is the question of their own names, which appeared in the latest tranche of Epstein files in ways that neither of them has yet chosen to address publicly. The royal family's response to all of this has been consistent with the approach it has taken to Andrew specifically for several years now, which is to say, it has been methodical, deliberate, and largely without warmth. King Charles issued a brief statement on the day of the arrest acknowledging the situation and confirming that the law must take its course. Prince William's office issued a similarly spare comment about being deeply concerned by the continued revelations. William himself was in Saudi Arabia for an official visit and did not return early. The royal schedule continued without interruption. Princess Anne carried out a pre-scheduled visit to a prison in Leeds on the same day. The message being sent, through actions rather than words, was one of orderly continuation of an institution that had already done most of the work of separating itself from this situation long before February 19th arrived. The timeline of that separation is an important context for understanding what Ferguson's position actually is within the wider royal picture. Charles stripped Andrew of his titles in October 2025. The eviction from Royal Lodge followed. The arrest came weeks after the eviction. At each stage, the palace moved first, before events forced its hand, in a way that suggests a level of advanced knowledge or preparation that officials have never directly confirmed or addressed. Getting Andrew out of Royal Lodge before investigators needed to go into it was, practically speaking, a sensible piece of sequencing. Whether that is what the timing represented is something the palace has not commented on. What is clear is that Ferguson had no protection from any of this. She was not a working royal. She had no formal relationship with the institution beyond the courtesy title that was quietly dropped in October 2025. She had no claim on the support mechanisms that the palace can extend to members of the family when a situation requires managing. She was, in the most practical sense, on her own. Whatever financial arrangements she had relied on, whatever network of support had sustained her lifestyle over the years, whatever public identity she had constructed through decades of reinvention and commercial activity. All of it was built on foundations that turned out to be far more fragile than they appeared. The inner circle that surrounded her during the years at Royal Lodge, the staff, the advisors, the friends who moved in and out of that world, has been notable for the same quality that characterized the staff at Royal Lodge more broadly. No one has spoken, not in any meaningful sense. Not about what daily life inside that building actually looked like, not about the meetings that took place there, not about the financial arrangements that were discussed within its walls, and not about what Ferguson herself knew or did not know about the activities that are now the subject of a criminal investigation. That silence, across a wide enough group of people, over a long enough period of time, is not simply the result of legal agreements or professional discretion. It is the silence of people who understand that what they know is significant and who have made a calculation about the risks of saying it. For Sarah Ferguson, moving between remote hotels and the guest rooms of acquaintances, the silence is probably the only strategy that makes any sense right now. But strategies built on silence have a habit of becoming unstable when the material that investigators are working through starts to fill in the gaps that the silence was designed to protect. There is a question that sits underneath all of this, one that the official record has not yet answered and that the people best placed to answer it are not currently talking. It is not a complicated question, but it is a significant one. What happens next? Not to Andrew, whose legal situation is at least defined in its outlines. He has been arrested, released under investigation, and is waiting to find out whether the Crown Prosecution Service will decide that the evidence gathered is sufficient to bring charges. That process will take the time it takes. The charge of misconduct in public office carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment in the United Kingdom, though sentences of that length are not typical for this kind of offence. The legal bar for securing a conviction is genuinely high, and experienced criminal lawyers have pointed out that the prosecution would need to establish specific conditions about Andrew's role, his intent, and the seriousness of the breach before a jury could be expected to convict. None of that is straightforward. None of it is quick. But the question of what happens next applies to Ferguson in a different, and in some ways more open-ended way. She has not been arrested. She has not been charged. No formal investigation targeting her specifically has been announced by any British police force or prosecutorial authority. In the eyes of the law, as it currently stands, she is a private citizen who has been named in documents released by a foreign government in connection with a deceased sex offender, and whose former husband is under investigation for a separate offence. That is an uncomfortable position to be in, but it is not, by itself, a legal one. What could change that is the investigation itself. Criminal investigations do not stay within the boundaries that were originally drawn around them. They follow the evidence. When investigators began searching Royal Lodge, they were looking for material connected to the misconduct in public office allegation against Andrew. The emails, the forwarded documents, the communications records that would establish what he sent to Epstein and when. That is where the investigation started. But investigations into complex cases involving multiple parties, sustained over years, conducted from within a physical space that is now being assessed for everything it contains, tend to expand rather than contract as they progress. The material recovered from the estate is being examined. The full scope of what was found has not been disclosed. And the relationship between Andrew's activities and Ferguson's own correspondence with Epstein, which was being conducted during the same period and from the same address, is a thread that any thorough investigation would be expected to follow. Her own emails place her in direct financial contact with Epstein during the years covered by the misconduct investigation. The question of whether she had knowledge of what Andrew was sending to Epstein, or whether any of her own communications touched on matters that could be considered relevant to the investigation, has not been publicly addressed. That does not mean it is not being privately considered. Investigations of this kind produce disclosure requirements that extend well beyond the immediate circumstances of the original charge. Once a criminal process is formally underway, documents and communications that might otherwise remain private can become relevant to proceedings. The investigation into Andrew is the door. What is behind that door is something that investigators are still, by all available accounts, working to understand. The Epstein files themselves are not finished. The United States Department of Justice has been releasing documents in tranches as part of a process that has been building for years and that has not yet reached its conclusion. Each new release has the potential to surface additional material, additional names, additional email chains, additional financial records that map the full geography of how Epstein's network operated and who benefited from it. The January 2026 release was the one that directly triggered Andrew's arrest. The one before that had already cost him his titles. There is no particular reason to believe that the releases have now stopped, or that the material already in the public domain represents the complete picture. For Ferguson, that ongoing process is the most significant source of uncertainty she faces. She cannot control what the Department of Justice chooses to release, or when. She cannot manage documents that are already in the hands of American investigators and that are being made public on a schedule that is entirely outside her influence. Whatever she knows about the full extent of her correspondence with Epstein, whatever financial arrangements existed between them that have not yet appeared in the released material, whatever meetings took place, and whatever was said in them, sits inside a filing system that is being worked through by people who are not subject to the carefully worded statements that have characterized her public communications for the past several years. The broader picture that emerges from the Epstein investigation, taken as a whole, is one of a network that was far more extensive and far more deeply embedded in legitimate institutions than most people understood at the time. The files released so far have implicated individuals from politics, finance, entertainment, and the law across multiple countries. Some of those individuals have faced serious legal consequences. Many have not, and may never. The investigation has moved at its own pace, driven by the availability of documents and the capacity of legal systems in different jurisdictions to process what those documents contain. Andrew is the most prominent British figure to have faced arrest in connection with the files, but he's not the only British figure whose name appears in them in contexts that raise serious questions. Peter Mandelson, the former British ambassador to the United States, is separately under investigation in connection with his own communications with Epstein. Other names connected to British public life appear in the files in various contexts, and the process of working through what those appearances mean, both legally and reputationally, is ongoing. The Andrew and Ferguson situation is not an isolated incident. It is the most visible part of a much larger process of exposure that has been building for years and that shows no signs of reaching a natural conclusion. For the institution of the British royal family, the challenge posed by this moment is different in kind from the challenges it has faced before. The death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022 removed the central figure who had navigated the family through previous crises, with a combination of personal authority and institutional discipline that her successors have found genuinely difficult to replicate. What has followed since has required Charles and those around him to manage a series of serious difficulties simultaneously, including the ongoing complications arising from Harry and Meghan's departure, the health challenges faced by both the King and Princess Catherine, and now the arrest of a senior royal in connection with one of the most significant criminal cases of the modern era. The tools that royal public relations typically relies on, the careful statement, the dignified silence, the managed reappearance at the right moment, are not well suited to a situation in which the timeline and content of revelations are being controlled by a foreign government releasing documents according to its own legal obligations. The royal family cannot manage this story. It can only respond to it. And its response, so far, has been to do what institutions under pressure typically do, which is to protect the center at the expense of the periphery. Andrew is the periphery. Ferguson is further out still. The titles have gone. The home has gone. The funding has gone. The formal relationship with the institution has been severed at every point at which it could be severed. If further revelations emerge, if the investigation expands, if additional documents surface that place either Andrew or Ferguson in a more serious legal position, the palace will not be in a position where it can be seen as complicit or as having failed to act. It acted. It acted early, and it acted decisively, and the record of those actions is now public. Whatever comes next is, from the palace's perspective, someone else's problem. For Ferguson, that reality has no softening edge. She spent 30 years operating in the shadow of a royal connection that opened doors, provided a home, lent credibility to commercial ventures, and gave her public identity a foundation that purely private means could not have provided. That foundation has been removed, quickly and without ceremony, by an institution that had already spent years communicating, through its actions, that she was tolerated rather than valued. The companies are dissolved. The charity is closed. The title is gone. The house is gone. And the man she shared all of that with is living in a modest property on his brother's estate, waiting for prosecutors to decide his fate. What Sarah Ferguson is waiting for is harder to define. There is no formal process she can point to, no specific date on which something will be decided, no single outcome that will resolve her situation one way or another. The investigation will continue at its own pace. The documents will continue to be released at the pace the American authorities choose. The questions about what she knew, what she did, and what she was connected to inside that building will continue to be asked by journalists, investigators, and a public that has found, in this story, something that speaks to questions much larger than the fate of one former duchess. She called him the brother she always wished for. She told him she was at his service. She asked to work in his house. And she did all of this from inside a mansion that is currently being taken apart by forensic specialists, working through material that has not yet been fully disclosed to the public. The chaos that has overtaken her inner circle in the weeks since the arrest is not simply the chaos of bad headlines or uncomfortable press coverage. It is the chaos of people who built their proximity to power on foundations that are now being examined under very bright lights, and who are discovering, one by one, that the distance they thought they had maintained from the worst of it may not have been as wide as they believed. The script that Sarah Ferguson had been trying to write for herself, the one about reinvention and resilience and a woman who survived every setback the world threw at her, has run into a story that is being written by someone else entirely. And that story is not finished yet.